Autism Awareness Month kicks off. South Africans living with autism continue to face obstacles like unemployment, a limited choice of schools, discrimination and a general lack of support. We're joined now by Vicky Utley, who's an education specialist at Autism South Africa. Vicky, thank you so much for your time this morning. A very good morning to you. Let's chat a little bit about perhaps even autism, just to start off from the defining point of it. What is it? What defines the condition? And how does it impact some of the citizens in our country?
So that's a very broad question. Autism is considered a autism spectrum condition or disability, and autistic people, sure, they can interact differently, they can communicate differently, they can behave differently. So some autistic people speak, some autistic people don't speak. Some have minimal language, and some can have a conversation speaking like you and I would. So it really does depend on each person. They're all completely different, and that's one of the reasons why we call it a spectrum. Some of the sort of defining characteristics that we see is 9 times out of 10 we will have sensory difficulties, so sensory processing difficulties, and that means that lights can be too bright, sounds can be too much. They might seek out certain sensory sensations, so textures. They might avoid certain sensory sensations. It really is a spectrum, and there really is a broad kind of definition of autism out there. My sort of best platform to learn about autism from is from autistic people themselves.
Yeah, I mean, as we're speaking about even just some of the realities that have been faced with the people living with autism, I would say that a lot of education still needs to go into, civil society and educating them about how to live with somebody and how to care for somebody with autism. I'm thinking even particularly children that come from the rural community where this may not be a reality of diagnosing autism in itself.
Yeah. And you've touched on something that's quite difficult for many families, is that diagnosis process is incredibly hard to navigate for many families. Generally speaking, for families with private medical care, it's a little bit easier, but it is incredibly expensive. For our families who don't have access to their private medical care, it is a minefield to navigate. And it's one of the services that we try and help with in terms of navigating that process to get the diagnosis. But you're absolutely right. In the rural areas, those families also have to then travel a very long distance in order to get to the local hospital where they can get the diagnosis. So, our advice often to families is, if you're concerned about your child, firstly, take a deep breath, relax. It's not the end of the world. There are things to help you and to support your child. But we will try and guide those families so that they can start supporting their child within the home environment.
Before we get into the education component, Vicky, perhaps we should start off with understanding what does autism look like in terms of the symptoms in children? I'm thinking that a lot of the parents, and I go back to more, disadvantaged communities, because in disadvantaged communities, there's so many other socioeconomic issues to follow on that, being able to diagnose a child quickly may not necessarily be a reality for them. So in children, for example, what are we looking at? If I'm a parent and I'm watching this, I'm thinking, look, my child is not developing as one would deem normal children. What are we looking at here in terms of the defining points?
So first off, we don't call it symptoms because it is not, we don't consider autism to be a disease or an illness. So we call them the signs of autism. Yeah. And some of the sort of hallmark signs that we see are children who don't speak at the same age as typical children. We see children who play differently to their peers, to typically developing peers. We see children who might, what we call do is stim. So that is self-stimulatory behavior. And these children might clap their hands, they might spin, they might do all sorts of repetitive movements. First point of call with that is to never stop it unless it is harmful to the child. Stimming is a way to help these children regulate and calm down, and also to focus. So those are sort of the 3 big ones that we tend to hear of first when parents are concerned.
Sure. And then just in terms of educating, children, even adults really, living with autism, how does one even think about the type of education? I mean, can we send the children, will they be able to adapt, for example, in a normal kind of schooling environment? Or would we actually have to get an education specialist to say this child actually needs a school that caters specifically for children who are living with autism? How do you navigate around the education component of the child and even of the adult who may want to go to school?
So again, autism is a massive spectrum. There's no one size fits all. Some autistic children can cope in a mainstream school with support and with help. Others need specific schooling. Other children require very specialized schooling where you might work on communication, where you might work on motor skills. But I think it's really important to just put out there that every single autistic child is highly intelligent. And yes, there will be intellectual disability, but it's important that we treat these individuals as human beings, as children. And yes, they have autism and we give them support there, but they're still people at the end of the day. So we need to respect them and treat them as people.
Yeah. Just speak to us a little bit. I want to expand on that in terms of being able to, how do we treat them as people? You know, one, I think it's a series that I actually managed to watch. I was focusing on somebody with autism. Of course, it may be exaggerated simply because of the nature of film, is The Good Doctor. And often looking at, I think his name was Sean or something, who's living with autism, and he is a doctor, so as it were. And it speaks about the discrimination at first that people living with autism would go through, and how sometimes people just don't understand. Looking at the South African context, right, how much discrimination is there when it comes to persons living with autism, and how much misunderstanding do we still have to navigate?
A lot. There is masses of discrimination against the autistic community. And so that's one of the big areas that we're trying to work through and help out with. And I think it just starts with, you know, they're people. Yes, they're autistic, but they're also people. And they are people with their own community. They are people with their own culture. So it's also up to us to start bridging that gap and to start listening to autistic people and understanding things from their perspective, and not assuming that the neurotypical, which is, you know, kind of the non-autistic viewpoint, is the right viewpoint. There's a big drive at the moment to say that autism is a natural part of human diversity. And I think that's a really great kind of stepping stone for us to start bridging that gap between the neurotypical world and the autistic community, and to start listening to them and saying, okay, how do we better support the autistic community? How do we better accommodate? What do we need to do as neurotypical people to help you navigate our world?
Yeah. So you've got neurotypical parents that would have an autistic child, who are then having to navigate this very difficult path of raising a child, because, and in some instances, you'll often hear parents saying that, I just don't understand, I don't know what to do, I love my child, but I actually don't know what to do. What advice can you give to parents who have got autistic children, who sometimes feel overwhelmed by just the realities of that it comes with?
It is overwhelming, and we've met many parents along, you know, since I've been part of Autism South Africa in the classroom. There's so many parents, and they're all overwhelmed, and it's a daunting journey. But the parents that I work very closely with, the best thing for them is to listen to other autistic people and hear from them what works. And for me, the biggest impact that I have seen with the kids that I've worked with recently is to presume that they're intelligent, presume that they're competent, stop treating them as though, if you've got a 12-year-old, stop treating that 12-year-old as though he's 3 or 4. Because I can promise you now, he is understanding, or she is understanding and listening. It might not look like it, but they're listening, they're understanding, they're taking in information the whole time. So for my parents, that has been a game changer in terms of just talk to them like you would a typical child. Treat them like a typical child. Get them involved with the family, even if you think they're not taking part. Share what's happening with the family. Share your news, what's happening at work. Obviously keep it age appropriate, but don't exclude your child from what you're doing. They know when they're being excluded, and that comes out later on in behavior and in what we call dysregulation. And if your child does have dysregulation, don't try and compete with that, if I can put it in that way. Rather try to keep yourself as calm as possible. And yes, I know it's difficult, but when meltdowns happen, the problem there is the brain is in what we call fight or flight mode. So that child's rational thinking, or that person's rational thinking, is no longer working. And the more upset you get as a parent or an educator or a caregiver, the worse the meltdown becomes. So it's important to try and bring your regulation down so that your child's regulation can also come down.
Yeah, we have to leave it there. Vicky Utel, thank you very much for your time this morning. Was an education specialist at Autism South Africa, just giving us some nuggets of wisdom in terms of how is it that you can support persons living with autism.